The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty settlement of Cedar Ridge, as Sarah Mitchell hung laundry behind her family's modest cabin. At 19, she possessed the kind of beauty that made men stop their work to watch her pass, golden hair that caught sunlight like spun wheat, and eyes the color of summer sky. Her father, Thomas Mitchell, had built their homestead 3 years ago, believing this remote corner of Arizona territory would offer his family a fresh start after losing their farm in Kansas. The settlement consisted of only 12 families, each trying to carve out a living from the harsh desert landscape. Thomas worked as the local blacksmith, his strong hands shaping horseshoes and repairing wagon wheels for the occasional travelers who passed through on their way to California. Sarah's mother, Margaret, had died giving birth to her younger brother Samuel 2 years prior, leaving Sarah to manage the household and care for the 8-year-old boy. Life in Cedar Ridge moved at a predictable pace. The men worked from dawn to dusk, the women tended gardens and children, and everyone gathered at the small wooden church on Sundays to pray for rain and protection from the Apache bands that roamed the surrounding mountains. The settlers had heard stories from other communities, tales of raids, kidnappings, and burned homesteads, but Cedar Ridge had remained untouched, perhaps because of its remote location or sheer luck. Sarah often wondered about the Apache people who lived in the mountains visible from her kitchen window. She had never seen one, though she sometimes found arrowheads near the creek where she collected water. Her father warned her to stay close to the settlement, but Sarah's curious nature sometimes led her to wander farther than she should while gathering herbs for cooking or searching for wildflowers to brighten their simple home. The Apache warrior known as Fierce Eagle had been watching the settlement for weeks. From his position high in the rocky cliffs, he could observe the daily routines of the white settlers without being detected. At 25, he was considered one of the most skilled hunters and warriors in his band, led by Chief Standing Bear. His real name was Nalnish, meaning he works, but the settlers would come to know him by the English translation the traders used. Fierce Eagle's interest in the settlement went beyond simple reconnaissance. His band had been forced from their traditional hunting grounds by increasing numbers of settlers and soldiers. Game was becoming scarce, and tensions between his people and the newcomers grew stronger each day. Chief Standing Bear had ordered several warriors to study the smaller settlements, looking for weaknesses and opportunities. But something else drew Fierce Eagle's attention to Cedar Ridge. During his observations, he had noticed the young woman with golden hair who moved with grace around the small homestead. There was something different about her, a kindness in her interactions with the child, a gentleness in how she tended the small garden, a strength in how she carried herself despite obvious hardships. He found himself returning day after day not just to gather intelligence but to watch her. The Apache way of life was changing rapidly. The old traditions of hunting and following seasonal migrations were becoming impossible as their territory shrank. Some warriors spoke of raids to take horses, cattle, and supplies needed for survival. Others talked of taking captives who could be traded for goods or ransom. The discussions around the evening fires grew more heated as food became scarcer, and the pressure from encroaching settlers increased. Fierce Eagle understood the necessity of adaptation, but he also carried the weight of his grandfather's teachings about honor and the proper treatment of enemies. His grandfather, a respected medicine man, had taught him that strength came not just from skill in battle, but from wisdom in knowing when to fight and when to show mercy. These lessons created a conflict within him as he watched the innocent settlers below, particularly the young woman who seemed to embody a purity that reminded him of his own sister, lost to a cavalry raid 3 winters ago. The morning that would change everything began like any other. Sarah woke before dawn to prepare breakfast for her father and brother. She stirred the fire back to life, added wood, and set water to boil for coffee. Thomas would need a hearty meal before heading to his forge, and Samuel required constant encouragement to complete his morning chores before the informal schooling session that Mrs. Henderson provided for the settlement's children. As she worked, Sarah hummed a melody her mother used to sing, a hymn about finding strength in difficult times. The simple tune filled the quiet cabin and seemed to make the morning tasks feel lighter. She prepared cornbread and fried salt pork, luxuries that had to be used sparingly since the nearest town was a 3-day journey away. Outside, the settlement was beginning to stir. She could hear Mr. Davidson calling to his cattle, and the sound of axes splitting wood echoed from several directions. Mrs. Patterson's baby was crying, and somewhere a rooster crowed its announcement of the new day. These familiar sounds created a sense of security and community that made the isolation bearable. Sarah stepped outside to collect eggs from their small chicken coop, breathing in the cool morning air before the day's heat became unbearable. The sky was clear, promising another scorching day, but for now the temperature was pleasant. She noticed fresh horse tracks near their well, probably from Mr. Jenkins checking his property lines again. The man was constantly worried about Apache raiders, though Sarah sometimes thought his fears were exaggerated. As she bent to gather eggs, a strange feeling came over her, the sensation of being watched. She straightened slowly, scanning the horizon and the rocky cliffs that rose in the distance. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling persisted. A mockingbird called from the mesquite tree near the house, and a lizard scurried across a sun-warmed rock. Everything appeared normal, yet something felt different. Unknown to Sarah, this would be the last ordinary morning of her life as she knew it. High above, Fierce Eagle made his final observations before returning to his band with information that would set in motion a series of events none of them could have predicted. The peaceful routine of Cedar Ridge was about to be shattered, and the lives of everyone in the small settlement would be forever changed by the decisions made in the next few days. The attack came at dawn 3 days later, when most of the settlers were still in their beds. Fierce Eagle rode with 12 other warriors, their horses' hooves thundering across the desert floor like approaching storm clouds. Chief Standing Bear had decided that Cedar Ridge was vulnerable enough to provide the supplies his people desperately needed without significant risk to his warriors. Sarah was awakened by shouting and the sound of gunfire. She bolted upright in her narrow bed, heart pounding as she tried to understand what was happening. Through the thin cabin walls, she could hear her father's voice calling her name urgently. Samuel began crying in the next room, frightened by the chaos erupting around their home. Thomas Mitchell grabbed his rifle from above the fireplace, his hands shaking slightly as he checked the ammunition. He had fought in the Civil War and knew the sound of battle, but this was different. This threatened everything he had worked to build for his family. He called to Sarah to gather Samuel and hide in the root cellar behind the cabin. But before she could respond, the front door exploded inward. 3 Apache warriors entered their home, moving with the fluid grace of men accustomed to swift raids. Their faces were painted with traditional war paint, red and black stripes that made them appear both magnificent and terrifying in the dim morning light. Thomas raised his rifle, but one of the warriors was faster, striking him with a war club before he could fire. Sarah screamed as her father collapsed to the floor, blood flowing from a wound on his head. She grabbed Samuel, pulling him behind her as she backed toward the rear of the cabin. The little boy was sobbing uncontrollably, clinging to her nightgown with desperate fingers. Everything was happening so fast that her mind could barely process the reality of their situation. The warriors spoke rapidly in their own language, gesturing toward Sarah and her brother. She could not understand their words, but their intentions seemed clear. One of them, a younger man with intricate beadwork on his shirt, approached them slowly, his hands raised in a gesture that might have been meant to calm her fears. Outside, the sounds of the raid continued. She could hear Mrs. Patterson screaming for her children, and the sharp crack of rifles as some of the men tried to defend their homes. Smoke was beginning to seep under the door, suggesting that at least one of the buildings had been set on fire. The smell of burning wood mixed with gunpowder created an acrid haze that burned her throat. Fierce Eagle appeared in the doorway, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Even in her terror, she could not help but notice his commanding presence. He was taller than the other warriors, with broad shoulders and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to assess everything instantly. His long black hair was adorned with eagle feathers, and his muscular chest bore the scars of previous battles. He spoke sharply to the other warriors, clearly giving orders. They stepped back, allowing him to approach Sarah and Samuel. His gaze fixed on her face, and for a moment the chaos around them seemed to fade into the background. There was something in his expression that was not quite what she had expected. Not the savage cruelty that stories had led her to imagine, but something more complex. Thomas Mitchell stirred on the floor, groaning as consciousness returned. Blood matted his graying hair, and he struggled to sit up, blinking in confusion. When he saw the Apache warriors in his home and his children cowering in the corner, Understanding flooded back. He tried to rise, reaching desperately towards Sarah and Samuel. One of the warriors raised his war club again, but Fierce Eagle barked a command that stopped him mid-swing. The warrior looked puzzled but lowered his weapon. Fierce Eagle continued to study Sarah, as if trying to solve some internal puzzle. She met his gaze, too frightened to look away, and something passed between them that neither could have explained. The sound of approaching horses drew Fierce Eagle's attention to the window. Through the thin glass, he could see that the raid was nearly complete. Several buildings were burning, and his warriors were loading captured supplies onto pack horses. A few of the settler men lay wounded in the dirt, but Chief Standing Bear had ordered that no unnecessary killing should take place. Fierce Eagle made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of simply taking what goods could be carried, he pointed at Sarah and spoke a single word in Apache. The other warriors nodded, understanding immediately. They moved toward her and she instinctively pushed Samuel further behind her. Thomas Mitchell found his voice despite his injuries. He begged them to take whatever they wanted but leave his children alone. His words came out in a desperate rush, mixed with promises of more goods, money, anything they might want. But the warriors did not understand English well enough to comprehend his pleas, and even if they had, their orders were clear. Two of the warriors gently but firmly separated Samuel from his sister. The little boy fought with surprising strength for someone so small, kicking and biting as they carried him toward the door. Sarah lunged after him, but Fierce Eagle caught her arm, his grip strong but not painful. She turned to face him and the words came tumbling out before she could stop them. She pleaded with him not to take them, her voice breaking with terror and desperation. She offered to work for them, to serve them. Anything if they would just leave Samuel with their wounded father. The little boy needed care, needed familiar surroundings, needed the only parent he had left. Fierce Eagle listened to her words, not understanding the language but comprehending the emotion behind them. Her courage impressed him. Even in her fear, she was thinking of others rather than herself. This was not the behavior he had expected from one of the white settlers, who were often described by his people as weak and selfish. The other warriors were growing impatient. Through the open door, they could see Chief Standing Bear signaling that it was time to leave. Settlements this close to military posts could not be raided for long without risking pursuit by cavalry units. Every moment they delayed increased the danger to the entire band. Fierce Eagle made his choice. He spoke again in Apache, pointing first at Samuel and then at Thomas Mitchell. The other warriors looked confused but nodded their understanding. They released the boy, who immediately ran to his injured father. Then Fierce Eagle looked directly into Sarah's eyes and spoke one word in English that he had learned from traders. The word was mine, and though his pronunciation was heavily accented, its meaning was unmistakable. Sarah understood that her fate had just been decided by this imposing warrior, who seemed to command the respect of the others. She was to be taken, while her family would be left behind. As the realization hit her, Sarah looked back at her father and brother one last time. Thomas was trying to stand, blood still flowing from his head wound, reaching toward her with trembling hands. Samuel was crying her name, not understanding why the bad men were taking his sister away. The image of their desperate faces would be burned into her memory forever. Fierce Eagle lifted her easily onto his horse despite her struggles. As they rode away from the burning settlement, Sarah twisted in the saddle to watch Cedar Ridge disappear behind them. The life she had known, the simple routine of caring for her family and managing their household, was ending. Whatever lay ahead in the Apache camp, she knew there would be no returning to the world she was leaving behind. The journey to the Apache camp took 2 days through rugged mountain terrain that Sarah had never imagined existed. Fierce Eagle kept her mounted in front of him on his powerful horse, one arm around her waist to prevent her from falling or attempting escape. At first she remained rigid with fear and anger, but the constant motion and her own exhaustion eventually forced her to lean back against his broad chest for support. They traveled through narrow canyons where the walls rose so high that the sky appeared as only a thin ribbon of blue overhead. Ancient pictographs decorated some of the rock faces, images of hunters, animals, and symbols that spoke of people who had lived in this harsh landscape for countless generations. Despite her circumstances, Sarah found herself fascinated by these glimpses into a world she had never known existed. Fierce Eagle rarely spoke during the journey, but she became aware of his careful attention to her comfort. When they stopped to rest the horses, he offered her water from his leather pouch and shared strips of dried meat that, while unfamiliar, helped sustain her strength. His treatment was not unkind, though she remained his captive, and this confused her understanding of what she had been taught about Apache people. The other warriors in their group showed varying degrees of curiosity about their captive. Some watched her with obvious suspicion, perhaps wondering if bringing a white woman to their camp was wise. Others seemed indifferent, treating her presence as simply another aspect of the raid's success. None of them spoke English, and her attempts to communicate through gestures met with limited success. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the landscape changed dramatically. Desert plants gave way to pine trees and grassy meadows that seemed impossible in this arid region. Hidden springs provided clear, cold water, and wildlife was more abundant than anything Sarah had seen near the settlement. She began to understand why the Apache fought so fiercely to protect these lands. On the evening of the first day, they made camp in a sheltered valley beside a small stream. The warriors hobbled their horses and built a small fire, its smoke dispersing quickly in the mountain breeze. Sarah sat apart from the group, unsure of what was expected of her and afraid to move without permission. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in fully. Fierce Eagle approached her as darkness fell, carrying a blanket woven in intricate patterns of red, black, and white. He placed it around her shoulders without speaking, but his dark eyes studied her face in the firelight. She sensed he was trying to gauge her state of mind, perhaps wondering if she would attempt to escape during the night or if she might collapse from the stress of her ordeal. Sarah pulled the blanket closer around herself, grateful for its warmth as the mountain air grew cold. The stars overhead were brighter than any she had ever seen, unobscured by the dust and smoke of civilization. Despite everything that had happened, she found a strange peace in the vast silence of the wilderness, broken only by the soft sounds of the stream and the occasional call of a nightbird. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of Samuel calling her name and her father reaching toward her with bloodied hands. She woke several times to find Fierce Eagle sitting nearby, apparently standing guard over the camp. His vigilance was both comforting and unsettling. She was being protected, but also prevented from any possibility of escape. The second day brought them to the Apache camp itself. Hidden in a box canyon that could only be accessed through a narrow passage between towering rock walls, the location was defensible and invisible from any distance, revealing the strategic thinking that had allowed these people to resist encroachment for so long. Sarah estimated that nearly 200 people lived in this hidden sanctuary. The camp consisted of traditional Apache dwellings called wickiups, dome-shaped structures made from wooden poles covered with brush and hides. They were arranged in family groups with larger structures that appeared to serve communal purposes, scattered throughout the area. Gardens of corn, beans, and squash occupied the most protected areas, while horses grazed in a natural meadow nearby. The arrival of the raiding party created immediate excitement and curiosity. Women and children emerged from their homes to see what had been captured, and Sarah felt the weight of countless stares as Fierce Eagle rode through the camp with her still mounted before him. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to hostility, and she heard rapid conversations in Apache that she assumed concerned her presence. Chief Standing Bear waited near the largest wickiup, an impressive figure whose age was difficult to determine. His face was deeply lined by years of sun and wind, but his posture remained straight and his eyes sharp with intelligence. Eagle feathers adorned his gray hair, and his clothing bore the elaborate beadwork that indicated his high status within the tribe. Fierce Eagle dismounted and helped Sarah down from the horse, keeping one hand on her arm as he approached his chief. The conversation that followed was entirely in Apache, but Sarah could tell from their gestures and expressions that her fate was being discussed. Other warriors from the raid joined the discussion, apparently giving their own opinions about what should be done with their captive. An elderly Apache woman approached the group, her weathered face stern as she examined Sarah closely. This was Singing Bird, Standing Bear's wife, and a woman whose opinion carried significant weight in tribal decisions. She spoke sharply to the men, clearly expressing disapproval of something, and Sarah wondered if her presence was creating division within the camp. Children began to gather at a safe distance, their dark eyes wide with curiosity at this strange woman with pale skin and golden hair. Some of them had probably never seen a white person before, and their innocent stares were less threatening than the suspicious looks of many adults. A few of the braver children crept closer, apparently fascinated by the color and texture of her hair. The discussion between the men grew more animated, with several warriors gesturing emphatically towards Sarah. She caught glimpses of English words mixed with the Apache, soldiers, trouble, trade, that suggested they were debating the practical implications of keeping her in the camp. The presence of a white captive could bring unwanted attention from the military. Finally, Chief Standing Bear raised his hand for silence. He spoke directly to Fierce Eagle, his tone carrying the authority of final decision. Though Sarah could not understand the words, she sensed that her immediate fate had been determined. Fierce Eagle nodded respectfully and turned back toward her, his expression unreadable. Singing Bird stepped forward again, this time addressing Sarah directly in broken English. Her words were heavily accented but understandable. You work. You learn. You live as Apache or you die as enemy. The old woman's eyes were hard as flint, making it clear that this was not a negotiation, but a statement of the only options available. Sarah nodded her understanding. Though her heart pounded with the realization that her old life was truly over, she was no longer Sarah Mitchell of Cedar Ridge, but a captive whose survival depended on her ability to adapt to a completely foreign way of life. As Singing Bird led her toward a smaller wickiup on the edge of the camp, she wondered if she possessed the strength to endure what lay ahead. Behind her, she could hear Fierce Eagle speaking with Chief Standing Bear in low tones. Though she did not understand their words, something in the warrior's voice suggested that her story in this Apache camp was just beginning. The man who had claimed her as his captive had plans that went beyond simple acquisition of a white woman, and Sarah sensed that her future was tied to his in ways she could not yet comprehend. Life in the Apache camp proved more challenging than Sarah had imagined possible. Singing Bird assigned her to work with the women, beginning each day before dawn with tasks that tested both her physical strength and her determination to survive. Her hands, once soft from domestic work in her family's cabin, quickly became calloused from gathering firewood, preparing hides, and grinding corn with stone tools. The Apache women watched her with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Some were openly hostile, viewing her as a symbol of the white settlers who threatened their way of life. Others seemed more willing to accept her presence, especially after witnessing her willingness to work without complaint. Most challenging was the language barrier that made every instruction a lesson in patience and observation. Morning Bird, a woman near Sarah's age whose husband had been killed in a cavalry attack, became her reluctant teacher. She spoke enough English to give basic commands and showed Sarah how to perform the endless tasks required for survival in the mountains. Under her guidance, Sarah learned to identify edible plants, prepare traditional foods, and repair the constant damage that harsh weather inflicted on clothing and shelter. The work was backbreaking, but Sarah gradually discovered a rhythm in the daily routine that helped her cope with homesickness and fear. She learned to weave baskets from pine needles and yucca fibers, creating containers for gathering and storing food. Her first attempts were clumsy, earning disapproving clicks from the older women, but persistence eventually produced baskets that met their standards. Fierce Eagle maintained a careful distance during her first weeks in the camp. She would sometimes catch glimpses of him training with other warriors, or see him speaking with Chief Standing Bear about matters that seemed important to the tribe's survival. When their paths crossed, he would nod acknowledgement but rarely approached her directly, leaving Sarah to wonder about his intentions. The warrior's apparent indifference puzzled her more than outright hostility would have. She had expected to be treated as property, used for labor or traded for goods, but instead found herself in a strange liminal space where her status remained unclear. Other captives in the camp, mostly Mexican women taken in raids years earlier, had been absorbed into Apache families through marriage or adoption. But Sarah's situation seemed different. Children in the camp provided unexpected comfort during those difficult early weeks. Unlike the adults who viewed her with wariness born of experience, the children were fascinated by her differences. They would gather around when she worked, chattering in Apache, and occasionally attempting English words they had learned from traders or previous captives. Little Bright Star, a girl of perhaps 8 years, became particularly attached to Sarah. The child had lost her parents in a disease outbreak the previous winter and lived with her grandmother, an ancient woman whose failing eyesight limited her ability to care for an active child. Bright Star would bring Sarah wildflowers or interesting stones, offering small gifts that gradually helped heal the wound of missing Samuel. As autumn approached, the camp began preparations for the harsh mountain winter. Sarah participated in gathering pine nuts, processing acorns, and preserving meat from hunting expeditions. The work required cooperation among all the women, and she slowly began to understand the complex social relationships that governed Apache life. Respect was earned through contribution and endurance rather than birth or status. One evening, as Sarah sat mending a tear in her increasingly worn dress, Fierce Eagle approached her fire. He carried a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin and placed it on the ground beside her. Without speaking, he unwrapped the bundle to reveal a traditional Apache dress made from finely worked hide and decorated with intricate beadwork in blues and whites. Sarah stared at the garment in amazement. The workmanship was extraordinary, clearly representing many hours of skilled labor. The dress would fit her properly, unlike the makeshift clothing she had been wearing, and the decorations marked it as suitable for someone of importance within the tribe, rather than a simple captive. When she looked up to thank him, Fierce Eagle was studying her face with that same intense expression she remembered from their first encounter. He spoke quietly in Apache, and though she could not understand his words, his tone suggested something significant was being communicated. The few phrases she had learned were insufficient to comprehend his meaning, leaving her to puzzle over his intentions. Morning Bird appeared at her elbow, having witnessed the exchange. In her halting English, she explained that the dress was a gift that carried meaning beyond simple clothing. It indicated that Sarah was being considered for a position within the tribe that went beyond temporary captive. The implications made her heart race with both hope and apprehension. Over the following days, Sarah noticed changes in how some of the Apache people treated her. The open hostility diminished, replaced by a cautious acceptance that allowed her to participate more fully in camp activities. She was included in the evening gatherings where stories were told, and decisions affecting the entire community were discussed, though the language barrier still prevented her from understanding most of what was said. Fierce Eagle began spending more time near her, offering instruction in Apache words and customs that would help her navigate tribal life more successfully. His teaching methods were patient but thorough, correcting her pronunciation of important phrases and explaining cultural nuances that could prevent misunderstandings. During these lessons, Sarah glimpsed the intelligence and sensitivity beneath his warrior's exterior. The first snow fell earlier than expected, dusting the canyon walls with white and signaling the approach of the season when the tribe would be confined to their hidden valley. Preparations intensified as everyone worked to ensure adequate supplies for the months ahead. Sarah found herself assigned to increasingly important tasks, suggesting that her position in the community was becoming more secure. One afternoon, while she was helping to repair storm damage to one of the wiki-ups, Singing Bird approached with a serious expression. The old woman spoke rapidly in Apache to Morning Bird, who translated with obvious reluctance. Sarah was being summoned to meet privately with Chief Standing Bear, a development that could dramatically alter her circumstances within the tribe. As they walked toward the chief's dwelling, Morning Bird offered advice in her broken English about proper behavior during such a meeting. Sarah should speak only when directly addressed, keep her eyes downcast as a sign of respect, and be prepared to answer questions about her intentions regarding life among the Apache people. The meeting would determine whether she could remain in the camp or would be traded away before winter made travel impossible. Chief Standing Bear received her in the formal area of his wiki-up, seated on a beautifully woven rug with several of his advisors arranged in a semicircle around him. Fierce Eagle sat among them, his face carefully neutral as Sarah approached. The atmosphere was solemn, suggesting that important matters affecting the entire tribe were being considered. The chief spoke slowly in English, his accent heavy, but his words clear enough to understand. He asked about her family, her skills, and her willingness to accept Apache ways completely. The questions probed her commitment to the tribe and her understanding that returning to white society was no longer possible. Sarah answered honestly, acknowledging her grief for her lost family while expressing gratitude for the protection and instruction she had received. When Chief Standing Bear finished his questions, he turned to Fierce Eagle and spoke in Apache. The conversation that followed was lengthy and apparently significant, with several of the other advisors offering their opinions. Sarah waited anxiously, aware that her fate was being decided but unable to influence the outcome through anything other than her previous behavior, and demonstrated willingness to work. Finally, Chief Standing Bear addressed her again in English, his words carrying the weight of tribal law and custom. Her status in the camp was about to change dramatically, and the life she would lead among the Apache people would be unlike anything she had previously imagined. The decision would bind her to the tribe permanently, but it would also offer her a form of protection and belonging that could make survival in this harsh wilderness possible. Chief Standing Bear's decision echoed through the wickiup like thunder in the canyon. Sarah would be formally adopted into the tribe, but not as the daughter or sister of an existing family. Instead, she would become the wife of Fierce Eagle, cementing her place in Apache society through the most permanent bond their culture recognized. The announcement left her speechless, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of this change in her circumstances. Fierce Eagle's expression remained carefully controlled, but Sarah detected something in his eyes that might have been satisfaction mixed with concern. This outcome had clearly been his intention from the moment he claimed her during the raid, but the formal approval of the chief and tribal council made it irrevocable. She was no longer a captive to be traded or discarded, but neither was she free to choose her own destiny. The marriage ceremony would take place within the week, before the heavy snows made travel impossible and isolated the camp for the winter months. Singing Bird took charge of preparations, her earlier hostility replaced by the practical necessity of ensuring that tribal customs were properly observed. The old woman's efficiency suggested that marriages between Apache warriors and captured women were not unprecedented, though they required careful attention to cultural protocols. Sarah's emotions churned between relief and terror as the reality of her situation crystallized. Marriage to Fierce Eagle offered protection and status that could ensure her survival, but it also meant abandoning any hope of returning to her former life. She would become fully Apache, expected to embrace their customs, learn their language fluently, and perhaps bear children who would grow up as members of the tribe. During the days before the ceremony, she found herself observing Fierce Eagle with new attention, trying to understand the man who would soon control every aspect of her existence. He was respected among the warriors for his skill in battle and hunting, but she also noticed his kindness toward the elderly and his patience with children. These glimpses of his character offered hope that their union might involve more than simple domination. Morning Bird helped her understand what marriage among the Apache entailed, explaining the roles and responsibilities that would be expected of her as a warrior's wife. She would manage their household, prepare his meals, maintain his weapons and clothing, and support him in his duties to the tribe. In return, he would provide protection, share his hunting success, and include her in decisions affecting their family. The wedding dress created for the occasion was even more elaborate than the everyday clothing Fierce Eagle had given her weeks earlier. Made from the finest deerskin available in the camp, it was decorated with hundreds of tiny beads and intricate patterns that told stories of Apache history and mythology. The work represented contributions from many women in the tribe, suggesting that her marriage was viewed as important for the entire community. On the morning of the ceremony, Singing Bird and several other women helped prepare Sarah according to Apache traditions. They braided her hair in the style worn by married women, adorned her with jewelry made from silver and turquoise, and painted ceremonial designs on her face using pigments derived from local minerals. The transformation was so complete that she barely recognized herself in the polished metal mirror they provided. The ceremony itself took place at sunset, when the canyon walls glowed red in the fading light and the entire tribe gathered in the central area of the camp. Chief Standing Bear officiated, speaking the ancient words that would bind Sarah and Fierce Eagle together according to Apache law and custom. Though she could not understand all the Apache phrases, their solemnity and the reverent attention of the assembled people conveyed the significance of what was happening. Fierce Eagle wore his finest clothing for the occasion, a shirt decorated with porcupine quills and beadwork, leggings made from soft deerskin, and moccasins that had been crafted specifically for this day. His long hair was adorned with eagle feathers that indicated his status as a warrior, and war paint enhanced the strong lines of his face. Standing beside him, Sarah felt both humbled and honored to be joining herself to such an impressive man. The vows they exchanged were unlike anything from her Presbyterian upbringing. Instead of promising to love and cherish, they pledged to work together for the good of the tribe, to respect each other's contributions to their shared life, and to raise any children as proud Apache people. The words emphasize duty and mutual support rather than romantic love, reflecting a culture where marriages were practical alliances as much as emotional bonds. When the ceremony concluded, the entire tribe participated in a feast that celebrated not just the marriage, but the successful integration of a former enemy into their community. Sarah was presented to various family groups as Fierce Eagle's wife, receiving gifts and expressions of welcome that confirmed her new status. The acceptance felt overwhelming after weeks of uncertain positioning within the social structure. The wedding night brought private fears that Sarah had been trying to suppress throughout the preparations. She had no experience with intimate relationships, and everything she thought she knew about marriage came from observing her parents' partnership and the limited teachings of her church. The prospect of physical intimacy with a man she barely knew, despite their unusual circumstances, filled her with anxiety. Fierce Eagle seemed to understand her nervousness without requiring explanation. Instead of immediately asserting his marital rights, he spent the evening teaching her more Apache words and explaining customs that would help her function successfully as his wife. His patience and consideration surprised her, challenging assumptions about Apache treatment of women that had been shaped by frontier stories and gossip. Their first weeks of marriage established patterns that would define their relationship throughout the winter months. Fierce Eagle treated her with respect rather than dominance, seeking her opinions about household decisions and including her in conversations about tribal affairs when her limited Apache vocabulary allowed participation. Their physical relationship developed gradually, built on mutual consideration rather than simple assertion of ownership. Sarah discovered that being married to a prominent warrior brought both privileges and responsibilities that unmarried women in the tribe did not experience. She was consulted about matters affecting the entire camp. Her opinions carried weight in disputes between families, and she was expected to represent Apache values in all her interactions with other tribal members. As winter deepened, the isolation of the canyon camp created an intimate atmosphere where relationships were tested and strengthened. Sarah's language skills improved rapidly through constant interaction with tribal members, and she began to appreciate the sophistication of Apache culture that white society had never acknowledged. Their understanding of the natural world, their complex social structures, and their spiritual beliefs revealed a civilization far different from the savage stereotypes she had grown up believing. Fierce Eagle proved to be an excellent teacher, patiently correcting her pronunciation and explaining cultural nuances that could prevent serious misunderstandings. During long winter evenings, he shared stories of his childhood, his training as a warrior, and his hopes for the future of his people. These conversations helped Sarah understand the pressures facing the Apache as their traditional way of life came under increasing threat from expanding settlements and military action. The bond between them grew stronger as they worked together to maintain their household through the harsh mountain winter. Sarah learned to prepare traditional Apache foods, repair weapons and clothing, and participate in the ceremonies that marked important events in tribal life. Her skills as a seamstress, developed during her years caring for her family, proved valuable in creating and maintaining the complex beadwork and decoration that adorned ceremonial clothing. By the time spring arrived and the snows began to melt, Sarah had become fully integrated into Apache society. Her transformation was so complete that visiting traders who had known her before the raid would not have recognized the confident, capable woman she had become. The frightened captive had evolved into a respected member of the tribe, whose opinions were sought and valued by both men and women. However, the approach of warmer weather also brought disturbing news from the outside world. Scouts reported increased military activity in the region, with cavalry patrols searching for Apache camps and rumors of a major offensive being planned against all hostile tribes. The peaceful isolation of winter was ending, and decisions would soon need to be made about how to respond to these new threats. Chief Standing Bear called council meetings to discuss the tribe's options, and Sarah found herself in the unique position of understanding both Apache and white perspectives on the conflict. Her insights into settler motivations and military tactics proved valuable in planning defensive strategies. Though she struggled with the emotional complexity of potentially fighting against people who shared her original heritage, The spring also brought personal changes that would further cement Sarah's place in Apache society. She began to suspect that she was carrying Fierce Eagle's child, a development that filled her with both joy and apprehension. A baby would make her connection to the tribe permanent in ways that even marriage had not, but it would also create new vulnerabilities in an increasingly dangerous world. When she shared her suspicions with Singing Bird, the old woman's stern demeanor softened with genuine pleasure. A child born to Fierce Eagle and his wife would be seen as a gift to the entire tribe, representing hope for the future and the successful integration of new blood into Apache lineage. The pregnancy would elevate Sarah's status even further and ensure her protection during the difficult times ahead. Fierce Eagle's reaction to the news exceeded her expectations. His usual composed demeanor cracked to reveal deep emotion as he contemplated becoming a father. He spoke of teaching their child the skills needed for survival in Apache society, and ensuring that the next generation would be prepared to face whatever challenges the future might bring. His dreams for their unborn child revealed hopes and fears that made him seem more human and accessible than ever before. The arrival of spring brought more than just melting snow and returning wildlife to the Apache stronghold. A messenger from another band arrived with urgent news that would shatter the relative peace of the winter months. Colonel James Morrison, a career military officer with a reputation for aggressive tactics against Native Americans, had been assigned to lead a campaign specifically targeting Apache settlements in the region. Morrison was known among the tribes for his ruthless efficiency and his belief that the only solution to the Apache problem was complete removal or elimination. Unlike previous commanders who had been content with occasional patrols and defensive actions, Morrison planned a systematic campaign to locate and destroy every Apache camp in the territory. His arrival represented an existential threat to Chief Standing Bear's people. The news sent ripples of fear and anger through the camp. Warriors sharpened their weapons and checked their supplies while women began preparing for the possibility of sudden evacuation. Children sensed the tension among the adults and became quieter, more subdued as if understanding that their hidden world was no longer safe from outside threats. Sarah found herself caught between conflicting emotions as she listened to the discussions about how to respond to this new danger. Her pregnancy was beginning to show, and the thought of fleeing through dangerous terrain while carrying a child filled her with dread. Yet she also understood that staying in the canyon might mean facing destruction at the hands of soldiers who would show no mercy to Apache people or their allies. Fierce Eagle spent long hours in council meetings with Chief Standing Bear and the other senior warriors, developing strategies for protecting the tribe. The hidden canyon that had served as their sanctuary for years might become a trap if Morrison's forces discovered its location. Scouts were dispatched to monitor military movements and identify potential escape routes through the mountains. The discussions revealed deep divisions within the tribe about how to respond to the military threat. Some warriors advocated for aggressive action, launching raids against supply lines and isolated outposts to disrupt Morrison's campaign before it could gain momentum. Others argued for dispersal, breaking the band into smaller groups that could hide more effectively until the immediate danger passed. Chief Standing Bear listened carefully to all opinions before making his decision. The tribe would prepare for evacuation, while simultaneously organizing defensive positions that could be used if flight became impossible. Selected warriors would conduct harassment actions against military patrols to gather intelligence and slow their advance, but the primary goal would be preserving as many lives as possible rather than seeking glorious battles. Sarah's unique perspective became increasingly valuable as the tribe planned their response to Morrison's campaign. Her understanding of military tactics and settler motivations helped the Apache leaders anticipate their enemies' likely actions. She explained how cavalry units operated, what supplies they would require, and how their movements could be predicted based on terrain and logistical constraints. The irony of her situation was not lost on Sarah as she helped plan resistance against people who shared her original heritage. Yet months of living among the Apache had shown her that the stereotypes and justifications used to support military action were based on misunderstanding and prejudice rather than reality. These people had become her family, and protecting them felt like the most natural thing in the world. Preparations for evacuation revealed the remarkable efficiency with which the Apache could dismantle their entire way of life when necessary. Within days, the permanent-seeming camp was reduced to essential supplies that could be carried on horseback. Cache sites were prepared in remote locations where non-essential items could be hidden until it was safe to return. If that day ever came, Fierce Eagle worked tirelessly to ensure that Sarah would be able to travel safely despite her pregnancy. He modified equipment to make riding more comfortable for her, and identified trusted women who could assist with any medical needs that might arise during flight. His protective instincts had intensified since learning of her condition, and he was determined that both his wife and unborn child would survive whatever trials lay ahead. The first sign that Morrison's forces were approaching came from scouts who reported large dust clouds moving through the valleys. Below their hidden canyon, cavalry patrols were systematically searching likely locations for Apache camps, moving with a thoroughness that suggested they had good intelligence about the tribe's general area. Time was running out for a peaceful withdrawal from their sanctuary. Chief Standing Bear made the difficult decision to begin evacuation immediately, rather than waiting to see if their location would be discovered. The risk of being trapped in the canyon with women, children, and elderly members was too great to justify hoping that the soldiers would pass them by. Within hours, the entire tribe was moving through secret trails that led deeper into the mountains. The evacuation proved every bit as difficult as Sarah had feared. Her pregnancy made riding uncomfortable and exhausting, while the need for speed and silence added constant stress to an already challenging journey. Fierce Eagle rarely left her side, offering support and encouragement when the trail became particularly treacherous or when fatigue threatened to overwhelm her. They traveled mostly at night, using moonlight and their intimate knowledge of the terrain to navigate paths that would be invisible to pursuing soldiers. During the day, they rested in carefully chosen locations that offered concealment and defensive advantages if they were discovered. The pace was grueling, but Chief Standing Bear knew that distance from their former camp was their best protection. On the third night of their flight, disaster struck in the form they had most hoped to avoid. A cavalry patrol discovered their trail and began following their route through the mountains. The soldiers were moving faster than expected, suggesting they had Apache scouts or guides who understood the terrain well enough to track even the most careful movements. The news that they were being pursued sent waves of fear through the fleeing tribe. Warriors took up rear-guard positions to slow the cavalry's advance while the women, children, and elderly pushed forward as quickly as possible. Sarah realized that her condition might become a liability that could endanger everyone, but Fierce Eagle refused to consider leaving her behind or allowing her to sacrifice herself for the group's safety. As dawn approached, it became clear that the cavalry was gaining ground despite the warriors' efforts to slow their advance. Chief Standing Bear faced an agonizing decision about whether to stand and fight in a location of his choosing or continue fleeing, and hoped to find better defensive positions ahead. The choice would determine the fate of everyone in the band, including Sarah and her unborn child. Fierce Eagle approached Chief Standing Bear with a proposal that would demonstrate the depth of his commitment to both his wife and his people. He volunteered to create a diversion that might draw the cavalry away from the main group's trail, buying time for the tribe to reach safety, even if it meant sacrificing his own life. The offer revealed the warriors' understanding that some things were worth dying for, including the future represented by the next generation of Apache children. The decision about whether to accept Fierce Eagle's sacrifice would test every relationship and loyalty that had been built during Sarah's transformation from captive to tribal member. Her fate and that of her child hung in the balance as the most dangerous night of their lives began to unfold in the mountains above them. Chief Standing Bear studied Fierce Eagle's face in the pre-dawn darkness, weighing the warrior's proposal against the needs of the entire tribe. The sound of approaching horses grew closer with each passing moment, and the chief knew that decisive action was required to save his people. After a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, he nodded his acceptance of the plan that might save many lives at the cost of a few. Fierce Eagle turned to Sarah, knowing this might be their final conversation. In the months since their marriage, their relationship had evolved from necessity into something deeper, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared commitment to Apache values. He spoke quietly in her rapidly improving Apache, telling her that their child would carry the best of both worlds and must survive to bridge the gap between peoples who seemed destined for eternal conflict. Sarah grasped his hands desperately, wanting to argue against the sacrifice but understanding that no alternative existed. The weight of her pregnancy made escape impossible at the pace required to outrun cavalry horses, and staying with the main group would doom everyone. Through tears, she had learned to hide according to Apache custom. She whispered words of love in English that she had never been able to express before. The parting was swift, as it had to be with death approaching on horseback. Fierce Eagle kissed her forehead gently, placed his hand briefly on her stomach where their child grew, and then joined the small group of volunteers who would create the diversion. 4 warriors accompanied him, including his closest friend Swift Runner, and 2 older men whose children were among the fleeing families. As the volunteers disappeared into the rocky terrain above their position, Chief Standing Bear led the main group along a treacherous path that wound higher into the mountains. Sarah rode between 2 women who had been assigned to ensure her safety, though every part of her wanted to turn back and follow her husband toward almost certain death. The sound of her heart breaking seemed loud enough to alert the pursuing soldiers. The diversion began just as the sun crested the eastern peaks, flooding the canyon with golden light that revealed the pursuing cavalry in stark detail. Fierce Eagle and his companions attacked from 3 directions simultaneously, their war cries echoing off the stone walls as they engaged the surprised soldiers. The fierce assault created exactly the confusion and delay that Chief Standing Bear had hoped for. Colonel Morrison's forces responded to the attack with professional efficiency, but the Apache warriors' knowledge of the terrain gave them significant advantages in the initial engagement. They struck hard and then melted back into the rocks, forcing the cavalry to dismount and pursue them on foot, through passages barely wide enough for a single person. The delay bought precious time for the escaping families. Sarah heard the battle raging below them as they climbed toward a hidden pass that would take them deeper into the wilderness. The sound of gunfire mixed with war cries and shouted orders created a symphony of violence that tore at her heart. She knew that Fierce Eagle was down there, fighting desperately to give their child a chance at life, and the knowledge that she might never see him again was almost unbearable. The fighting continued for nearly an hour before the sounds began to fade, suggesting that the diversion was ending. Whether the Apache warriors had escaped or been overwhelmed was impossible to determine from their position high above the battle site. Sarah strained her ears for any sign that might indicate Fierce Eagle's fate, but the mountain silence revealed nothing about the outcome of his sacrifice. Chief Standing Bear pushed the fleeing tribe relentlessly through terrain that would have challenged them under normal circumstances. With pregnant women, young children, and elderly members, the pace was punishing, but everyone understood that their survival depended on reaching the sanctuary that lay beyond the high pass. Sarah's pregnancy made every step agony, but she forced herself to continue without complaint. By midday, they reached the crest of the pass and could look back toward the valley where the battle had taken place. Smoke rose from several locations, suggesting that the cavalry had set fires to flush out any remaining Apache fighters. The absence of any sign of their missing warriors created a heavy silence among the fleeing people, though no one spoke their fears aloud. The descent into the hidden valley beyond the pass revealed why Chief Standing Bear had chosen this route despite its difficulty. The valley was completely invisible from below, and accessible only through the narrow pass they had just traversed. A small stream provided fresh water, and scattered groves of trees offered both shelter and concealment from any aerial observation that might be attempted. As they established a temporary camp in the valley, Sarah felt the first strong contractions that indicated her pregnancy was approaching a critical stage. The stress of the flight and the emotional trauma of possibly losing Fierce Eagle had triggered early labor, creating a medical emergency in the worst possible circumstances. The women around her recognized the signs immediately and began preparing for a birth that was happening months ahead of schedule. Singing, Bird took charge of the situation with the efficiency that had made her Chief Standing Bear's most trusted advisor on matters affecting the tribe's welfare. She organized the other women to create a birthing shelter and gather the materials that would be needed for delivery. Her experience with difficult births in dangerous circumstances gave Sarah hope that both she and the baby might survive. The labor was long and difficult, complicated by the early timing, and Sarah's exhaustion from the arduous flight through the mountains. For hours she drifted between consciousness and delirium, calling out for Fierce Eagle and reliving the moment of their separation. The Apache women who attended her understood her anguish even when her words became unintelligible mixtures of English and Apache. As evening approached, Sarah's strength began to fail, and it seemed possible that both she and the child might be lost. Singing Bird made the decision to attempt a risky procedure that might save the baby, even if it cost Sarah's life. The old woman's hands were steady despite her age, guided by decades of experience with births that challenged both mother and child. Just as the situation seemed most desperate, the sound of approaching horses sent warriors scrambling for their weapons. The exhausted tribe prepared for what might be their final battle, knowing they lacked the strength to flee again. But the voices that called out from the darkness were Apache, not cavalry, and hope flared in hearts that had resigned themselves to death or capture. Fierce Eagle appeared at the edge of the camp, wounded but alive, supported by Swift Runner, who had also survived the desperate rearguard action. The sight of her husband's face gave Sarah the strength she needed for the final stages of labor, and within the hour she delivered a son who, despite arriving early, showed every sign of being healthy and strong. The baby's first cries echoed through the hidden valley like a promise of hope for the future. Chief Standing Bear held the infant briefly, speaking the traditional words that welcomed a new member into the tribe. The child would be raised as Apache, learning the skills and values that had allowed his people to survive in this harsh but beautiful land for countless generations. As Sarah held her son for the first time, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened girl who had begged not to be taken from Cedar Ridge no longer existed. In her place was a woman who had found her place among people she once feared, married a man she had learned to love, and given birth to a child who represented the possibility of peace between worlds that seemed destined for conflict. Fierce Eagle sat beside his wife and son, his wounds being tended by the tribal healer. The successful diversion had allowed most of Morrison's cavalry to be led away from the tribe's trail, though at great cost in Apache lives. The immediate threat had passed, but they all knew that greater challenges lay ahead as the white world continued to expand into Apache territory. The story that had begun with a desperate plea not to be taken from everything familiar had evolved into something none of them could have predicted. Sarah had indeed belonged to Fierce Eagle, as he had declared that day in her father's cabin, but the belonging had become mutual. They belonged to each other, to their son, and to the Apache people who had accepted them as family. In the hidden valley, surrounded by the mountains that had become their home, they faced an uncertain future with the strength that came from unity and love, transcending the boundaries that divided their worlds.